So, imagine this. $24 billion spent to fix a crisis. A huge amount.
Just staggering.
But the crisis actually gets worse. We're talking about a system that, well, it looks less like failed policy and maybe more like a financial scheme.
Uh-huh.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Today we're looking at a pretty big pile of sources, really, alleging some serious stuff. Wide-scale corruption, mismanagement, even fraud deep inside California's state programs.
Right.
And for you listening, the mission today is pretty simple. We need to follow the money. Where did these massive public funds actually end up?
Yeah.
Because the sources keep pointing to this pattern they call pay-to-play politics, this alleged link, between big political donations and then getting these really lucrative state contracts.
And the numbers, honestly, they just jump off the page. They really form the basis for this whole investigation.
They do.
California spent, get this, $24 billion on homelessness just since 2018.
Billion with a B.
More than any other state. Right. Now, what did they get for that massive investment? Well, nationally, homelessness actually fell by about 10% in that time.
Okay, so some progress nationally.
But in California, it went up by a staggering 31.6%.
Wow. That's not just failing, that's going backward at high speed.
Exactly.
If any private company got results like that after spending $24 billion, they'd be finished. Lawsuits everywhere.
Absolutely. So the immediate question, the one you can't avoid, is what happened to $24 billion when the problem got so much worse?
And this is where the sources make a really strong claim. They argue this isn't just like bad policy luck. They're alleging it's a corrupt system, their words, specifically used to launder money to political contributors.
Oh.
Through these incredibly high-cost, state-funded housing projects. That's the alleged mechanism.
Okay. Let's unpack that. The sources call it the homelessness shell game, and it starts with the policy itself, right? This housing-first approach.
Yeah. And the criticism laid out here is pretty fundamental. The policy provides the housing, often permanent and expensive housing, without dealing with the root causes, the addiction, the mental illness that often puts people on the streets.
And the sources put a number on that?
They estimate that maybe up to 80% of homeless individuals are really struggling with addiction or severe mental health issues.
But the state rules, they actually make it harder to treat those issues.
That's the really wild part, according to these documents. State regulations actually ban funding for programs that have requirements, like requiring sobriety or prohibiting drug use inside the housing.
Wait, so if a program says you need to stay clean to stay here, the state won't fund it?
That's the allegation, yes. So instead of funding things like, effective short-term shelters or detox centers or mental health support that could stabilize someone,
Right.
the system pushes funding towards these permanent units. And we're talking sometimes taxpayer-funded condos costing up to $1 million per unit.
$1 million for one unit. How is that possibly an efficient solution? That's enough to buy several homes in many parts of the country.
And that huge cost, that's precisely where the alleged corruption comes in, according to these sources.
Okay.
If you could build a decent, safe unit for maybe $200,000, but the state rules or contracts somehow push the cost up to $1 million, well, where does that extra $800,000 go?
Yeah, that's the question.
The sources allege it's engineered. That margin is there, allegedly, to flow back. Politically connected developers get these contracts for these super expensive units. They make huge profits. And then the allegation goes, campaign contributions are sort of expected back to the politicians who greenlit the project.
So the public crisis becomes a profit center for donors. That's the claim.
That's the core allegation in these documents, yeah. The public crisis funds the donor rewards.
It feels like this kind of thing, this alleged willingness to turn a crisis into cash for insiders, it probably needs a certain administrative culture to survive. And none of this spending, this alleged shell game, works if someone's actually checking the receipts, right? If there's real oversight.
Exactly. Which brings us to accountability, or rather the alleged lack of it. Let's call this section blocking the accountants.
Okay.
Because the document suggests that when people started asking hard questions about the $24 billion, when the pressure for an audit grew, Democrat politicians allegedly just circled the wagons. They actively refused calls for a full, independent audit of all that homelessness spending.
But it gets even more specific, doesn't it? Because there was someone inside the system calling it out.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting. We have a whistleblower, effectively. Los Angeles City Controller Ken Mejia, and he is an elected Democrat himself.
Okay, so not just an outside critic.
Right. He openly called out what he saw as potential fraud and waste. And the sources suggest he took a real risk speaking out against his own party's leadership in the city.
So what happened when an audit was supposed to happen in LA?
Well, the LA City Council was required to get an audit done on their homelessness spending. But instead of using Mejia's office, he's the independent elected city auditor, remember, and would have done it for free.
Free.
The city council voted to bypass him. They decided instead to spend nearly $3 million of taxpayer money on an outside firm.
$3 million to not use the free independent auditor.
Correct. And Mejia publicly stated that this outside firm wasn't even, in his words, a real audit firm. They were hired just to do an assessment.
An assessment, not an audit. Why pay $3 million to avoid a free real audit?
Well, Mejia's stated reason for blowing the whistle was exactly that. He alleged the whole point was to avoid transparency, to prevent his independent office from digging in and finding what he expected to find: fraud, waste, and abuse.
Spending millions to avoid finding waste. That seems to be the core allegation right there.
It really sums it up. The system, the sources claim, is built to keep outsiders from seeing where the money truly goes.
And this pattern, this apparent lack of financial care and blocking oversight, it wasn't just limited to homelessness, was it? The sources point to other big examples.
Oh, yeah. It seems to be a broader issue, according to these documents. A pattern of, let's say, fiscal disregard in other major state programs during that time.
Like the EDD, the
Yeah.
Unemployment Department.
Exactly. We have to talk about the massive failure at the Employment Development Department, the EDD, during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Just inexcusable, according to critics.
What was the specific failure?
The administration is accused of failing to implement a really basic safeguard: just cross-checking unemployment claims against the list of state prison inmates.
Wait, they weren't checking if the person claiming benefits was actually incarcerated?
Apparently not,
Yep.
or not effectively. And that failure, just basic operational negligence, had huge consequences.
How huge.
This alleged oversight led to an estimated $400 million to $1 billion in fraudulent claims being paid out in the names of inmates, including, like, infamous convicted murderers.
Hundreds of millions, potentially $1 billion, lost because they didn't check two lists against each other.
That's the allegation. Just staggering incompetence or worse. And then there's the COVID contract waste.
Ah, yes, the testing lab contract.
Right. The state awarded this huge no-bid contract, $1.7 billion a year, to a company called PerkinElmer for a massive testing lab in Valencia.
No bid, meaning they didn't shop around for the best price or service.
That's what no bid usually implies, and the sources definitely raise questions about why there wasn't competitive bidding for such a massive contract.
And how did the lab perform? Did taxpayers get value for that $1.7 billion?
Well, the data presented in the sources is pretty damning. The lab consistently underperformed, like way under expectations. In its first 10 months, it apparently processed only between 1% and 8.5% of all COVID tests done in this state.
1 to 8% for the giant state lab.
Yeah, despite all the investment. And even with that poor performance, dozens of reported problems.
Yeah.
The sources say the contract was just automatically renewed.
Auto-renewed. Wow, what about the cost?
That's another kicker. The state was paying about $37.78 per test at this underperforming lab.
Okay, not that high.
Well, compare it. Big school districts like LA Unified, they were using other vendors, reliable ones, and paying around $12 per test.
$12 versus almost $38.
More than 3 times the price for a lab that wasn't meeting its goals.
Yeah.
So you have to ask, why pay so much more for less performance? Why auto-renew a failing contract? The sources suggest it's either extreme lack of prudence or, well, maybe political favoritism again.
Okay, so let's connect these dots. We've got alleged mismanagement, blocked audits, wasteful contracts. How does this all tie back to the political donor class, the pay-to-play idea?
This is where the sources draw a really clear line. They detail what they see as a consistent pattern of legislative favors, little carve-outs and laws, special treatment for donors.
The most famous example has to be Panera-gate, right?
Oh, absolutely. That one got a lot of attention.
Yeah.
So the state moves to raise the minimum wage for fast food workers. Big deal. Affects lots of businesses. But then, buried in the law, the sources reveal, is this very specific, almost bizarre exemption. It excluded restaurants that bake and sell bread as a standalone item.
Bread as a standalone item, that sounds oddly specific.
It is. And who did that specific carve-out benefit? Well, it directly helped Greg Flynn. He owns 24 Panera Bread franchises in California.
Panera, they sell bread.
Exactly. And Flynn also happens to be a major donor to the governor's campaign. So the sources argue this wasn't some random oversight. It was a legislative gift, potentially worth millions, tailor-made to protect one specific donor's business from the new wage hike.
Wow. That's pretty blatant if true. Are there other examples?
Yeah, the sources mention others, like a special last call exception for alcohol sales.
Yeah.
It was granted specifically to the Intuit Dome, the new arena for the LA Clippers.
Okay, and the connection.
The arena's owner is Steve Ballmer. His wife had donated $1 million to the governor's campaign shortly before this exception was granted. Again, a targeted financial benefit seemingly linked to a large donation.
So the takeaway here, according to these documents, is pretty stark.
Very clear. The allegation is that immense state power, the ability to write laws and award contracts, is being used not primarily to solve public problems, but to reward political contributors and special interests, whether it's through these wasteful, maybe no-bid contracts or these very specific loopholes carved into legislation, all ultimately at the taxpayer's expense.
Right.
So the final context here is that the failure, especially on something as visible as homelessness in California, isn't just presented as bad luck or policy mistakes.
No, it sounds like.
It's described as a political machine, one that allegedly prioritizes profits for donors, through million-dollar condos or overpriced contracts, over actually fixing the crisis.
And the fact that you have Democrats like Comptroller Ken Mejia speaking out.
Exactly. That suggests that even some people on the inside recognize that this alleged corruption, this lack of accountability, it's visible and maybe even intentional.
So this deep dive really reveals a system where billions in public money meant for crises is allegedly being funneled to connected insiders.
Yeah.
While the very mechanisms meant to ensure accountability, like audits, are actively blocked.
That's the picture painted by these sources. And it leaves you with a pretty unsettling final thought to consider.
Which is?
Well, if these kinds of alleged fraud, waste, and avoidance tactics are so embedded in how the state handles its most visible crisis, like homelessness, what other state programs, the ones that aren't under such a bright spotlight, might also be diverting your taxpayer money away from where it's supposed to go and into the pockets of political benefactors?
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.